it could only be an introduction into the subject. We will go more deep into the different issues here in Germany in our lecture and in the presentations of the students. And it's the same with the students in Pekanbaru and Surabaya. They will do it on their own university. And at the end of the lecture, in some weeks' time, we will have some joint presentations between students here from Dortmund and also from Indonesian universities. So very nice to meet you again. Welcome everybody from our friends in Indonesia. You can't see them. I see them here. So, but there are people. And here are also some people, even from Surabaya and from Pekanbaru. You're very welcome. What is this? This is the wrong. Unfortunately, this is the wrong presentation. Hat einer von Ihnen einen Stick dabei? Hat einer von Ihnen einen Stick dabei? Die haben die falsche Präsentation da drauf. Hat hier einer einen USB-Stick? Haben Sie nicht die Präsentation? Nee, das ist die falsche. Das ist die von letzter Woche, haben die drauf gemacht. Zu Hause hat man 1000 Sticks. Hat wirklich keiner einen Stick? Ja. Ich kann einen USB-Stick haben auf den Händen. Ja. Hilft das? Ja, wenn der Länder bei USB ist, also hat er. Ja. Wir können das auch einfach auf oberster Ebene, dann kopieren wir das rüber und dann also ohne irgendwelche Sachen installieren. Also wir müssen da die Präsentation sehen. Genau, und die Original-Präsentation ist noch hier. Ja, genau. So. Hier. So. So, just a moment. Der PC. Normalerweise müsste ich hier aufkommen. Hier noch einmal. So, jetzt habe ich es. Also hier sieht man jetzt auch mein Handy. Und hier kriege ich jetzt. Genau, jetzt bräuchte ich nur noch die Originaldatei. Wo liegt die? Auf dem Desktop. Mhm. Die. So, dann kopiere ich die einmal. Ja. Jetzt. So. Jetzt einmal wieder rüber. Machst du auf oberster Ebene. Ja. Einstellung V. War die hier, ne? Ja. Eine Sekunde. Ja, ja. Mal gucken, ob es noch mit dabei ist. Ja. Vielleicht einmal hier so. Ne, einfügen kriege ich hier nicht hin. Sollen wir das sonst WeTransfer oder so? Ich krieg das hier nicht eingefügt. Ja, probier sonst mal, ja. Sonst, wie komme ich denn hier auf meinen E-Mails? Genau.
Ich könnte die anmelden. Bitte? Eindeutige hätte ich das nicht, aber ich hatte vielleicht auch Laptop, dann soll eigentlich funktionieren. Ja, komm mal hier und probier's mal mit, genau, Android. Genau. Mach das mal hier. So, die Datei haben wir auch noch in Kopie. So. Geräte. Ja. So. Christian. Ja, mach einfach die SD-Karte. Ja, vielleicht geht das jetzt, ja. So. Ja, perfekt, super.
Apple macht immer nur Ärger.
Entschuldigen.
Nein, nein.
Ne, kannst du glaube ich nicht auswerfen. Kann ich nicht? Egal. So, dann einmal rausziehen. Dann einmal rüber. An den offenen. Ja, mal. Ja, hier. Das Normale, dadurch, dass es Windows ist, sollte auch unterstützt werden, dass man es benutzt. Ich muss noch zulassen, ne? Zulassen. Durch nur die. Ich sehe noch keine aus. Ich glaube, die hat auf dem anderen Bildschirm, muss man auch was sehen.
Das ist erweitern.
Ah, hier, so, jetzt habe ich es, genau. So, genau. Und dann ziehst du jetzt auf den Desktop. Oder einfach kopieren. Bist du rüber kopiert? Ja, auf Desktop. Genau, und dann, das ist jetzt
Super, ja.
Vielleicht einmal
Maus, ja, klar.
Hat das gemacht? Ja. So, Data Protection Law in Europe. Das ist das eigene.
Das wollen wir jetzt sehen, genau.
Richtig?
Genau.
Okay, dann ist Präsentation wahrscheinlich ja. Einmal, ne? Ich sehe gerade nur nicht Ansicht. Start.
Ist das hier unten das?
Ja, da ist auch Präsentation
Da ist
starten.
er. Ja. Ja, ist es ja. Super.
Perfekt. Okay.
Mal sehen, ob es auch weitergeht. Ja.
Alles klar.
Ich sehe jetzt hier halt nicht. Ich muss da halt oben gucken.
Ja.
Maxi? Maxi,
Ja,
seht ihr jetzt die Präsentation über Data Protection?
bisher sehe ich noch Copyright Law Personal Rights.
Müssen wir das andere zumachen, ne?
Ja. Ja.
Maxi,
Ja,
seht ihr jetzt Data Protection?
ich sehe es jetzt auf Bildschirm, aber hier ist noch nichts freigegeben online. Die andere gerade war online auch freigegeben.
Seht ihr jetzt?
Also man kann es an der Tafel gut sehen.
Wie bitte?
Man kann es an der Tafel gut sehen, aber es ist nicht online freigegeben, wie die andere gerade freigegeben wurde.
Kommen wir mal.
Haben Sie eine spezielle Programmfreigabe gemacht? Oder?
Nee.
Auf dem Link. Achso. Das ist die Präsentation, die wir freigeben wollen. Nee, das war jetzt die falsch. Eigentlich hier hat den Fall in Syrien das Fenster wechseln immer.
Ja.
Wo haben Sie die Zoom-Übersicht in die komplette?
Ja, das kann ich glaube, wenn ich hier groß machen.
Ah, okay, okay.
Muss man damit noch freigeben machen? Genau.
Also, die haben noch, warte mal, welche der beiden ist das jetzt?
Ja, das. Aber sehen die uns dann auch noch?
Müsste
Ja.
eigentlich. Aber einfach mal auswählen.
Okay, dann mal so freigeben.
So. Ist das die richtige?
Ja, jetzt funktioniert's.
Ah, wunderbar. Ja. Ah, wunderbar. Max, ist in Ordnung?
Überragend.
Was sagt er? Ah, sehr gut. Okay, now we want to start. Technical problems. No way, but we will have not so long, so the time is enough. Today we will talk about data protection, and the interesting thing is that in Indonesia, they have a very similar data protection law than we have in Europe. So it means that they copied most of the regulations, most of the rules from the European law into the national law. And that's quite interesting because now it is important for Indonesia how to transfer the legal rules into their daily practice. So legal practice. The main point, what it makes different in Europe, this regulation in data protection is now that we have a data protection regulation, the general data protection regulation, and it means this is a European piece of legislation and it's directly applicable nationally. That means that we have it on the European level. There we have this regulation and it applies in every member state of the EU in the same way. So it means in Italy, they have the same data protection law as we have in Germany. And that means that in the end, the European Court of Justice is responsible how to define the specific rules in the data protection regulation. And it's not only to the national legislator. And that's different to other legislations where you have it only national-wide, as in Indonesia, for example. So it means that our application depends also how it will be decided on the European level. On the other hand, one of the most different points to the former regulation in the field of data protection before 2018, when the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, came into force, is that now we have really high fines. The fines in German law are really high, or in European law are now up to 4% of the annual turnover of the company. And it means not only the company who did the breach of data protection, but also the other group members. So when you have a big group, let's say Mercedes-Benz or you have Siemens, then the whole company, the whole group is responsible for the data protection infringement. And that means that it can come to really high fines, as we have for Google, for example, or to Facebook, where you can have fines more than 100 million euro. And this is different to the Indonesian regulation, where you don't have such high fines. And in practice, of course, the fines are one of the most important points when it comes to the way how to introduce and how to enforce data protection legislation. Because we already had data protection regulation before 2018, but nevertheless, it wasn't not so effective because the fines were not so high, and so it was sometimes more comfortable for the companies to infringe the law than to obey the law. And now under the new regulation, we have also stronger national data protection authorities. That means that in all member states, at least in the member states, you have data protection authorities. So you have an administration body who can decide about the fines, who can decide what you have to do in the field of data protection. And when you won't apply it, or when you don't want to obey it, you can go to court, or you have to go to court because you have an administration act. And this can be enforced by the different data protection authorities. In Germany, where you have a federal system with 16 national countries, here in Dortmund, we are in North Rhine-Westphalia, and you have even more countries like Bavaria and so on. You have different data protection authorities in every country. That means in Germany, we have more than 16 data protection authorities, because then you have additionally a federal data protection officer. And that means that you have so many bodies who are controlling the implementation of data protection rules in companies, that it is really important to have a system in your company how to enforce it and how to give it a part in your company administration management system, how you want to manage personal rights and how you want to manage the different rights the individual has under the GDPR. Here we want to do a comparison between the law in Europe and in Indonesia, PDPA, and especially how can the GDPR, the rule of Germany, be applied in the Indonesian context? What does it mean that you have to enforce the GDPR in Indonesia? As we have heard from Stefan before 2 weeks ago, on where we talked about ubiquity, it means it's the same in data protection law. Yeah, I know you can put it better. It's Ubiquität in German. Something. Ubiquity, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So it means that the transfer of personal data doesn't stop at the national border, of course, because you can transfer via the internet personal data wherever you want. And of course, you can also work with personal data everywhere. And so it's not bound to one country. So we have different questions. What is the scope of application? When is the GDPR or the rules in Indonesia applicable? When are bodies allowed to use personal data? So you need, for example, a consent, but there is also other opportunity to use personal data, but consent is, of course, one of the most important points. And then, of course, how can you enforce the rights of the individual under the regulations? For example, there's a right for the individual that it must be informed about the data processes, who does work with the data, who does process the personal data, who does use it, and so on. You have the obligation to inform the individual. And as a last point, of course, what are the consequences of a violation? And that leads us to the international applicability of the rules, where we will come to at the end of the lecture. What is the intention and motivation behind the law? You see here the development of the different regulations on EU level. And as you can see, we already had a directive on data protection in 1995. And this means directive, you have to implement it into your national legislation. It means that you have a German legislation, Bundesdatenschutzgesetz, where the rules of the directive were implemented. And now from 2016, we have this general data protection regulation, which is directly applicable. We don't need a national law anymore. It means that the individuals can ask the authorities to enforce the individual rights under the GDPR, and this is the binding law. We have still national law in the field of data protection, so we have still a legislation on data protection, Bundesdatenschutzgesetz, but this new BDSG, Bundesdatenschutzgesetz,
Recording in progress.
it only means that they have some additional rules to the general data protection regulation. So on a national level, it's not necessary anymore to have a legislation on data protection. The GDPR regulation would be enough. And you have a lot of member states in the EU which have no own data protection legislation. We only use the GDPR. But as you can imagine, in Germany, we are happy to write our own laws, our own rules. So we have this regulation on data protection, this Bundesdatenschutzgesetz, BDSG, additionally. But we have a hierarchy of rules. On the highest level, you have the EU rules, and then you have the rules on national level, and it means that the BDSG must be confirmed with the general data protection regulation. And this is a problem at the moment. For example, we have regulation in the BDSG about how to protect personal data in an employment context. And this seems to be against European rules, against the GDPR. And now we have a court decision from the European Court of Justice. And that means that possibly we are not allowed in Germany to apply this rule anymore. It's paragraph 26 in the German legislation. So we wouldn't have had this problem when we didn't introduce our own legislation and only work with the GDPR, but we drafted some own rules in Germany, and that means that now we have the problems whether it is conform with the European regulation or not. And as you see, in 2016, the GDPR was published, and it is applicable from May 2018. So there were 2 years to implement the rules in the companies and to build up the authorities. And so it was for 2 years. In Indonesia, we have the new rules from October 2022. And it was issued by the government, and now it is also into force. As we see, these are the figures for Indonesia, and everybody who visited the country knows that there are millions of internet users and of social media users. So it's so much higher the rate than in comparison to Germany. So this is quite interesting to see how it works. And therefore, we need data protection rules in order to protect the individual. For example, when you have a data breach. And especially in Indonesia, data breaches are a huge problem for companies, and that is quite easy to get personal data in the internet, for example, and they are not very highly protected in some ways. So this will be one of the tasks in Indonesian law, how to protect the people against data leaks when others are using their personal data, and how to enforce it, by which body. As far as I know, there isn't an administrative body at the moment to enforce it. We are still discussing about it. And so it means, on the one hand, it's very good that you have a very similar legislation to the European rules. On the other hand, it is always a question of enforcement. Which rights do you give to the individuals? Which rights do you give to the persons who are hurt by the infringement of their data protection rights. You see the percentage of population that owns a smartphone, 94%. So nearly everybody in Indonesia has a smartphone and is working with it. And for us in Germany, it's really surprising, for example, that you exchange a lot of documents via WhatsApp. In Germany, it would be forbidden to send personal data of students from our university to the University of Pekanbaru, to UIR, for example. But in Indonesia, it's common. It means on the one hand, it is very easy to work with. On the other hand, of course, you have a higher risk of data leaks, for example. So you always have to strike a balance between the different interests. And therefore, you can't say that it is better how we do it in Europe. In a way, it's more effective. On the other hand, it makes many things very complicated. For example, we are not allowed to use Zoom in our lectures. So it's good that it is offered by UIR, for example. The one point of this regulation, as you see, this is the regulation of the GDPR from 2016, is on the protection of natural persons. That means the first decision whether the GDPR applies or not is whether the protection of natural persons is relevant. So it is all about natural persons and not about companies, for example. They don't have rights under the data protection regulation. Only the individual can be protected under these rules. Here you see you always have to strike a balance between the protection of the individuals and the data, and on the other hand, that there should be a free movement of personal data. Especially when you are working in the internet or when you have an internet shop or so on, of course, you have a transfer of a lot of data, personal data. For example, to fulfill a contract, when you order something via the internet, then of course, the data must be transferred to the supplier. Therefore, you need rules under which this can be allowed and how you want to protect the personality. You need a data subject, as we said before, a natural person. And on the other hand, you need personal data. So only when it is covered by Article 4 GDPR, by the definition, then the GDPR applies. It means that when you have data which is not personal, the GDPR doesn't rule this specific situation. You have other data, of course, and 2 days ago, we had the first artificial intelligence directive in Europe, the first directive worldwide in this field. So now we have rules how artificial intelligence should work. And it means, as Stefan already said 2 weeks ago, in the field of artificial intelligence, you have, of course, personal data, which leads to a person. But on the other hand, you also have data which are not personal. Unpersonal data, for example, when you have rare machine data, how the machine works, how long it works, and so on. So you have data from machines which are not personal. And it means in this case, you are out of the GDPR. It's not covered by the data protection regulation, but it is covered, for example, by this new AI Act, and we will hear presentations on it later on. Or, for example, it can be also covered by the EU Data Act. In the EU Data Act, it will come into force also next year, the same with the AI Act. The EU Data Act covers the rules who apply when data has to be shared between companies, for example, or when you have data from machines, or you have data from some tools, let's say, for example, from a smartphone, from a health tracker, and so on. And then the EU Data Act says who has to share this data with whom, who is allowed to use it, and to whom is it forbidden to use this data. For example, you need these rules in the EU Data Act when it comes to autonomous driving. In this case, you need the communication between different cars, of course, in order to decide what happens in the traffic and so on, or what happens with the car, and to share information between cars, for example. This is what will be covered by the EU Data Act. And of course, it also covers personal data, because when you generate data in your car, it is personal data. And so it means when you have personal data, there are different legislations which can apply. In our case, it is about the protection of the person, of the individual. It's not about the protection of data. So data protection is not correct in a way, because it's not about the protection of the data. It's not about, in the first line, about data security. In the first way, it is about the protection of the concerned person. And the rules which should apply under which the data can be used. As you see, the definition in English, and you have also the translation in German, of course, it's Article 4, Paragraph 1, GDPR. Personal data means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, the data subject. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly. And you see a very similar definition was chosen in Indonesia in Pasal 1 PDPA, data pribadi, and you see a very similar regulation. It's also about identified or identifiable natural person. And this is the biggest problem with this definition, because an identified natural person, that's clear. It is with your personal data, like where you live, your name, your date of birth. These are directly related data with your person. But on the other hand, it's more difficult to define what is an identifiable natural person, because it means you need additional information which lead to a natural person. It's not a direct information like your name, for example. And this is the discussion, and the discussion goes on and on. What is a personal data in the field of identifiable? For example, the European Court decided, even before the GDPR came into force, that the IP address of your computer is a personal data. Because before, you can say the IP address of your computer, it's not personal, because it's not for the others that they know who is using the computer. It's only the tool, and it's not clear who is working with this tool. But the European Court said, in the moment where you work with your computer and you're in the internet and you have an IP address, then this IP address is a personal data. And it means that the processing of this personal data has to be decided under the GDPR because it's personal data. So it's about data protection. And that's very important, for example, when you have advertisement in the internet, when you have cookies, for example. The cookie collects personal data, for example, the IP address, and what is the person doing with this IP address, which pages are visited by this person, where is he, she coming from, and where is he, she going, what is she doing in the internet, how long is this person staying on one page, what is this person reading. So all the data collected in a cookie, for example, is personal data. Even that, for example, the person who initiate the advertisement doesn't know who is working with the computer in this moment. And that's what identifiable natural person means, that you have additional information and then you come to a natural person. And the question is, how far is it possible and how many information is necessary to identify a person? And this is nowadays a problem. For example, when you see the data of your iPhone, the email, for example, is it a personal data? You can say it's very similar to the IP address, so it's also personal data. And that means that the GDPR applies with all the rules about how to protect the data and so on. Personal data describes any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, and this could be nearly everything. And as you know, what you can do with computer systems, what you can do with cloud computing, you know that it is quite easy to put together a lot of information which can lead to a natural person in the end. And so it's always the discussion, is it personal data or not? And you have to decide it from case to case. So it's very easy when it is about an identified person, and it's very difficult when it is only an identifiable person. Let's say, for example, you have a personal number in order to use a machine, and then you have the information when this number uses the machine and what this person behind the number is doing with the machine. Then you must say also, this is personal data. Even that the system is not working to collect personal data. It's processing a lot of personal data, and this data is protected under data protection law. When we see that we have personal data, next we have to decide who is the controller of this data. And as you know, that's not so easy to decide in some cases, especially when you have the transfer of personal data to a third party who should process the data in your name. That means in every case, you have to decide who is the controller. In European law, it's defined. Controller means the natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which alone or jointly with others determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data, determining the purposes and means of the processing. These are the 2 points to decide whether somebody is the controller of the personal data. And when somebody is the controller, a lot of obligations apply to this controller in order to protect the personal data. In Part 1, paragraph 4, PDPA, you have a similar regulation. Who is the controller? On the other hand, you have to decide who is the processor of the personal data, because there are cases where the controller of the personal data is not also the processor. Processor means a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. On behalf of the controller. That means that somebody processes the personal data for you. You are still the controller, but you use a third person as the processor. And then you have specific rules applying because you are still the controller and you are in charge of the data and you have to protect it. That means you have to control the processor. It's not possible to give the personal data to a third person and then to say, let me alone, he's processing it. When you want to enforce your personal right, go to this processor. You are still responsible for the data, and the processor is only processing the data on behalf of you as the controller. So you are still responsible. For example, a call center is a typical processor because the call center is using the personal data. You give it to them, for example, the telephone numbers, and on behalf of the controller, they are working with the data, calling the people to sell something or so on. The data controller determines the purpose and control the processing of personal data, and the processor only processes the personal data, and this processor is not allowed to use the personal data for his or her own purposes. When you have a call center, the call center getting the personal data from you as the controller in order to use the phone numbers, for example, they are not allowed to use the personal data for other purposes than the purpose you told them before, because you are only processor, you don't have own rights on it. And then it is allowed under data protection law. You're allowed to use others as data processors. And for example, that's the same with cloud computing. When you provide cloud computing to others, you are the processor of personal data, and the controller, who has the right to use the data, uses you as the processor of the personal data and is still responsible for the data. And he must control you as the processor, that you process the data to the rules of the GDPR. Very important in this international context is the scope of application. Because as we already said, cross-border transfer of personal data is everyday business. That you have data in Indonesia or you have data in Germany or where else in Europe, and these data are processed in other countries. So the question in these cases is whether the GDPR or the rules of Indonesia apply to the specific processing of personal data in another countries. What we said before the GDPR, for example, when somebody blamed Google that they process the personal data, Google normally said, we are not a subject of the BDSG, of the data protection law, because we are not in Germany. We are somewhere else. We are, for example, in Ireland, or we are in on some islands somewhere in the sea. So our servers are not in Germany, and so the German data protection law doesn't apply. That was the argumentation of Google's before the GDPR came into force. Now we have a new regulation in Article 2 GDPR, and we have a very similar regulation in Pasal 2 PDPA in Indonesia, Article 2 GDPR says this regulation applies to the processing of personal data in the context of the activities of an establishment of a controller or processor in the Union. So it means wherever the data is processed in the European Union, then the GDPR applies. That's for sure. We have one common market in the EU, so the GDPR applies. But additionally, this regulation applies to the processing of personal data of data subjects who are in the Union by a controller or processor, not established in the Union, where the processing activities are related to the offering of goods or services, irrespective of whether payment of the data subject is required to such data subject in the EU, or the monitoring of their behavior as far as their behavior takes place within the Union. This regulation applies to the processing of personal data by a controller, not established in the EU, but in a place where member state law applies by virtue of public international law. That means that the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, also applies when personal data is processed in another country, in a third country outside the EU, when personal data of a Union citizen is relevant. When you have data of European citizens and they are processed abroad in other countries, let's say in the US or in Indonesia, then also the GDPR applies. And that's different to the rules we had before. And that means that, for example, it's not possible for Microsoft, for example, when they have Teams, for example, to say, we are not processing the personal data in Germany or in Europe, we process them in the US. It doesn't matter. They have to apply the GDPR in all cases where personal data of a data subjects who are in the EU is on stake. So this is a big difference. And this is important for you when you're in another country outside of the EU, that you must be also aware of the European law. And you have a similar rule in Indonesia. And so we have the interesting question. You have similar regulations, of course, so the differences are not so big. But nevertheless, in the end, which law should apply? When you have the processing of data of European data subjects or of Indonesian data subjects. This is one of the biggest questions in this international dimension of data protection. And this means, for example, that Facebook changed its strategy where to process personal data. Before, they processed most of the data from Africa, for example, in Ireland. And that means that all the data are also protected under European law. And that's why they put them now to Africa, where you have lower standards, possibly, or that they that it doesn't matter anymore whether they process the data of European citizens, of European data subjects, wherever in the world. They have to obey the rules of the GDPR. So you see this territorial scope of application. The regulation applies to the processing of personal data in the context of the activities who are in the Union by a controller or processor not established in the Union. So you see, this is quite important. You have the controller located in the European Union. You have data regarding people who are in the Union. the controller is not in the union, but in a place where member states law applies. These are the cases where European data protection law is relevant, especially data regarding people who are in the union. And this is quite difficult to explain to American companies, for example, because they say we have our own rules and we have the data now in the US. Why should we obey European rules? We have our own rules. Somebody is using Microsoft tools, for example, or using ChatGPT. And when he is from the European Union, European rules apply. But we process the data in the US. So this is quite difficult to understand for them. But this is the law. And then it is a question how to enforce the European rules. And that makes it sometimes very difficult. For example, during the Corona time, the Data Protection Authority of Berlin said, you are not allowed to use Zoom in school. And they said, we will fine teachers who use Zoom. So it means teachers who use Zoom and want to teach the people, the children also, even in the Corona time, they were liable under data protection law, and teachers doing nothing, they were not liable. Of course, in the end, nobody was fined. Nevertheless, this was the law. They were not allowed to use Zoom. And it's a good case to understand how data protection law can stop innovation, for example. Okay. Here, the summary, the GDPR is applicable in Indonesia if the controller has a branch in the EU or is dealing with data from a European citizen or somebody who is in the European Union. And the PDPA is applicable in the EU if the controller is dealing with data regarding the Indonesian jurisdiction or an Indonesian citizen. You see, very similar to the European rule. And if a controller located in the EU is dealing with data regarding Indonesian citizens, both the GDPR and the PDPA are applicable. So you have two different regulations on data protection law. In practice, you don't have a lot of differences in the rules, but nevertheless, you have two different legislations to apply. Here again, very similar in the Indonesian regulation. The controller located in the territory must abide no matter where the subject is located. This is quite important, and you should think about it. It's especially important when you're working in an international company and you have, for example, clients from all over the world, or especially from the EU. You have to look also to the European rules, and vice versa. When you have data from Indonesian subjects, you have also to obey Indonesian data protection rules. That is always the first decision, whether you have personal data, and second, which law does apply. And as we have seen, mostly the GDPR applies when it is about European citizens, or Indonesian data protection law when it is about Indonesian citizens, and vice versa. And then the next step is, okay, the GDPR applies. Then you have to decide, is there a justification that the controller is allowed to use the personal data? Because the general rule of data protection is that nobody is allowed to use your personal data. That sounds a little bit funny, because your personal data is used everywhere, as you know. because you give it to so many people and to so many companies and so on. So the principle is nobody is allowed to use it unless there is a justification. So the next step is always to look whether there is a justification that somebody is allowed to use your personal data as a controller. And you see the most known justification is consent. That somebody gives you the consent to use your personal data. But there are many cases where you don't have the consent of a person. For example, when you have something in the public sector, or there's a public interest, you see you have very similar rules in the Indonesian legislation. And what is very special in the European rule, in this Article 6, is Article 6F. This is the last one. You are allowed to process personal data when the processing is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interest pursued by the controller or by a third party, except where such interests are overridden by the interests of fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subjects, which require protection of personal data, in particular where the data subject is a child. This rule is quite complicated. And it's also a justification to use personal data. That means you have to strike a balance between the interest of the controller, a legitimate interest. This could be also the interest to send advertisement to people and to get the addresses of people. And on the other hand, the interest of the data subject. And to strike this balance between the different interests is quite difficult in practice. And we will talk about it in our lecture, of course, because you have to decide it from case to case. And that makes it more complicated than or to say, okay, we need a consent, or there must be a public rule that you are allowed to process my personal data, or you need my data for the performance of a contract, because it's very vague and you have to strike this balance. When is there a legitimate interest of the data controller, or when is it overridden by the interests of fundamental rights of the data subject? And in the end, this can be decided by courts only. And of course, we have some guidelines now by the authorities how to strike this balance, but nevertheless, in practice, in many cases, it's still difficult. You see, these are the different possibilities of justifications, and especially it's F, Article 6, lit F, where you have to strike this balance. And this is really difficult, and we can't discuss it now. In the end, we come to the consequences of a violation. And this is one of the biggest difference between Indonesian and European law. You have, of course, to pay compensation. You have administrative fees. There can be criminal provisions in some cases and other sanctions. And especially the fines are quite high now. As I said before, it is up to 4% of the annual takeover of a company. This can be millions of euros. And in Indonesia, you don't have such high fines at the moment. And therefore, then it is a question how to enforce the rules. Because companies are normally not so keen on introducing the protection of personal rights in their business. For example, the use of personal data for advertisement or for other issues in companies is for them more important than to protect them. Because in the end, data protection doesn't earn money. So you need high fines in order to enforce the rules. In Indonesian law, as far as I see, and we will see it in your presentation about Indonesian law, that you have more criminal provisions, probably, that you don't enforce it by fines, so in civil law, but more via criminal law. And that will be interesting in your presentation here about the differences between European and Indonesian law, because the rules are so similar. So you can say it's the same. No, it's not the same, because the way to enforce it, the way how the authorities are working, I think there is no real authority at the moment in Indonesia to enforce it. That you have a authority, as we have in Europe, in North Rhine-Westphalia, for example, you have this data protection officer, and you can send him a letter and can say, okay, this company infringes my personal rights. And then the data protection officer will scrutinize whether your rights are infringed or not. And in the end, he or she can even put fines on this enterprise. And he or she, the officer, can decide how, for example, you have to change your data protection management system, your security. So the data protection authorities have a really, they have really strong powers to enforce the law. And this is on the one hand quite good for the individual, for the data subject. On the other hand, of course, it limits the actions of the companies. And in order to be compliant with the data protection rules, you must introduce in your company a data protection management system, and that costs a lot of money. So you spend money before you earn money in order to fulfill the GDPR, the data protection rules. And that's why it is for some companies even very difficult to comply with all rules. And this is one of the biggest disadvantages of the European rules. And it is one of my points to criticize the regulation. Of course, it's very good to have a high level of data protection law, but under the GDPR, you put in general the similar rules on small and middle-sized enterprises as you put on big companies. Of course, for Siemens, it's no problem to employ 4, 5, 6 people only to introduce a data protection management system. For them, it's easy. But when you are a small company with 6 people and you have, in general, similar rules, then you have, for big companies, this could be quite difficult. And that is one of the points whether the GDPR is highly criticized by companies, for example. Here you see there's even the possibility to put non-material damage compensation on infringers, on controllers who infringe your personal rights. For example, we talked about it before in the lecture, that, for example, when somebody uses your telephone number without consent, without being allowed to do so, then the courts normally decide that you get around 500 euro. So, of course, you have to go to court first. This is probably the complicated point, but you have the possibility, and it means when you have a lot of people applying for 500 euro and you have class actions, for example, then it can become even very expensive. And then you have, of course, this administrative fee. You have this in Article 83, paragraph 1, where you have up to 10 million euro or 2% but there's also the possibility to put 4% and until 20 million euro. Here you see a very similar regulation in the PDPA, but as far as I know, it's not the same as we have in European law. I think you will work on it in your presentation. What is the difference? So I'm really waiting for your presentation on this subjects. And you have a very long provision in this PDPA in Article 67 about criminal provisions. So we can say, as a result, probably, that in Indonesian law, you are more focused on criminal actions. For example, when you have a data breach. And probably in European law, you are more focused on fees and on civil compensation. But I wait for your presentation. You see, both have the way to put compensation and to put administrative fees on enterprises, but in the end, as you see, it's only up to 30,000 euro. 5 blah blah 9 miles rupiah. So that's different. And in Europe, we can see that the awareness for data protection law is quite high in the companies, because data protection law becomes more and more a part of the general rules on compliance. And that means that the companies, most of them, try to implement a protection system in their general rules of compliance, because in the end, it's a big advantage when you have court actions, for example, where you are forced to delete most of your data. Let's say you have a lot of data, personal data from persons who are interested in your products, for example, then it's really difficult for you and very harmful when the court or the authority order that you have to delete the data and you are not allowed to use them anymore. So it is quite important for the companies to introduce a data protection management system. Up to here, it's 11:45. The lecture is finished in Dortmund. So thank you very much. We will deepen all the subjects in the lectures and also with the presentations from our German Indonesian groups. Thank you very much to everybody. Sorry for the inconvenience.
Recording stopped.
Yeah, now it's over. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bona. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Akbar, hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Everything fine?
All good,
Thank you
yeah.
very
I'm
much
sorry.
again.
Yeah, sorry that I joined quite late earlier.
Yeah. Who is next week from UIR?
I think it's going to be me or Pak Ardi.
Okay. We are waiting for it. Thank you very much again.
Sure.
Thank you very much to the
Our pleasure,
students.
Bona.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.